Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the GIS, of course, the Grenada Information Services, and whichever platform you're joining us from this evening, that of the Grenada Cultural Foundation. I think MTV is carrying us, along with all other platforms carrying us on this special. Happy Emancipation Day to all of you, and welcome to the virtual panel discussion put on by the GCF. The theme for Emancipation this year, guided by our ancestral spirits, seeking reparative justice, or reparative justice. And the topic for of discussion this evening is reparative justice for Grenada. I am Brenda Batiste, and I'm your moderator. We'll be here with you from just at this time through till about 8 o'clock, and we intend to have very lively, edifying, and informative discussion on this Emancipation Day. We have pulled together a great line of panelists to discuss. Earl Bousquet. Earl Bousquet, he is a veteran St. Lucian and Caribbean journalist, renowned, respected, and revered, and he's also the chair of the St. Lucia Reparations Committee. Dr. Kellon Bubb, he is our very own Dr. Kellon Bubb, that is, lecturer. He's assistant professor, of media and communications at Montgomery College in Washington, D.C. He hails from the beautiful village of Pomrose in the parish of St. David. Rihanna Bruno, she's a social science, sociology, and psychology and history student at the TAMCC. She also joined us for this discussion. Dr. Damian Graves, Professor Dr. Damian Graves, that is, and he is a lecturer at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at St. George's University. And joining us later would be Mr. Claude Douglas, is a lecturer at T.A. Marisha Community College and author of When the Village Was an Extended Family in Grenada. So we are very, very happy to welcome all the panelists who have joined us this early to start our discussions. The year was 2013 when St. Vincent's Prime Minister Dr. Ralph Gonsalves first introduced to CARICOM the pursuit for the quest for reparations from Britain and the other European nations that benefited from the transatlantic slave trade. CARICOM agreed, and the Caribbean Reparations Commission, CRC, was established. Caribbean community nations are now actively seeking reparative justice to make European nations like Britain and France pay reparations for the brutal transatlantic slave trade that had cost the lives of millions of Africans. And so this evening, our discussion, the virtual panel discussion we're having, of course, some virtual, some in studio here with me, which is good. So I am not alone. I have great energy to do this. Seeking the topic reparative justice for Grenada, and of course, we're guided by the overarching theme of Emancipation 2021, which is guided by our ancestral spirits seeking reparative justice. For the purposes of this discussion, ladies and gentlemen, whenever we refer to the term slavery, it will be about the transatlantic slave trade. As we are very well aware, slaves have been kept, Arabs kept slave, Europeans, Africans enslaved Africans, but our discussion is really around the transatlantic slave trade. So again, we welcome our panelists. Ambassador Ali Gill, he's a chairman of the Grenada Reparations Committee. He's also an attorney at law, a former culture minister. Of course, he's an editor, writes on various topics, politics, culture, history. Those are some of his favorites, but of course, he always writes on things that generally affect us. So we welcome all the panelists with us. So before we get in, I'm going to kick off with you, Ambassador Gill. Let's examine, first of all, before we go, today's Emancipation Day. And it's 183 years since. Do you believe that slave descendants are liberated like centuries after the slave trade? And did enslavement, history books say all different things, but did enslavement end with just the dotting of just the signing of a signature on a dotted line?
Thank you very much, Brenda, and happy Emancipation Day to all of our listeners. And it's a day of reflection, a day of commemoration, and we, the Grenada National Reparative Committee, is glad to partner with the Grenada Cultural Foundation to commemorate this year's Emancipation Day celebrations. Now, emancipation is a process, and you made the point in your introductory remark with regards to making the distinction between slavery here in the so-called New World as a direct result and part and parcel of the Atlantic slave trade. Now, you have to understand that what we had in the so-called New World as chattel slavery is incomparable to what other slavery that existed before and after. In the sense that slaves were not considered to be human beings, but rather a property. Now, even in Grenada here, the planters at the time considered the enslaved Africans, and we are not descendants of slaves. We are African descendants. The history of black people in the Caribbean, of African people in the Caribbean, began in Africa. It did not begin on the slave plantations. And we have to be absolutely clear about these particular issues. And what we commemorate today is the end of chattel slavery on the plantation. That is what we commemorate. With regards to the mental, with regards to the economic enslavement of our people, that is a process that still continues, basically. And hopefully we can get into the details of that. But I wanted to make the point that chattel slavery at the time, chattel slaves was considered even more precious, and a greater value was put on the assets of the enslaved Africans than even on land during that time. In other words, there was a quotation back in the history in those days that there is no use having land without labor. And it is this labor that built the major cities of Europe. It is this labor that built London, Holland, France, and other major European cities that took part in the enslavement of African people. And for us in Grenada, when we speak of reparative justice for Grenada, we are saying that in 1834, when you have to recall that 1834, the end of slavery proper, and then you had a period of what they call amelioration that took it up to 1838. But amelioration was a prolongation of slavery, and amelioration again was a process whereby the British government put a structure in place to enslave or to maximize free labor for the planter class. One will appreciate that after emancipation, the British government compensated the plantation owners and the slave owners, and they never compensated the free laborers, because at the end of the day, they considered the enslaved Africans as property and not human beings. And that is extremely important for us. So that is by way of introductory remark. Just to answer your question though, emancipation is a process. What we commemorate now is the end of an era, the end of an epoch where Africans were enslaved on the plantations here in the Caribbean, here in Grenada. But when we speak of mental, when we speak of economic enslavement, that is a process that is ongoing. Of course, one can admit that we have made some progress, but I believe there is significant, there's a long way to go. In fact, one of my pet peeves is that Valentine's Day, Father's Day, Mother's Day still have far more significance in my society than Emancipation Day. Emancipation Day for us is far more significant than any of these days. And yet for all, Emancipation Day is not given the sort of significance that it deserves.
So we are on the right track. Ambassador Gilge dovetailed me into the next. And I'll throw that across to Earl Bousquet in St. Lucia. So let's examine the enslavement of the Africans, and Ambassador Gill alluded to it, and its impact as we lay the path for this reparative justice platform. The legacies from slavery, Mr. Bousquet, do we still suffer from those? And is that suffering beyond economics? And is that the linchpin, if you will, that's driving this reparative justice movement?
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to share with you this evening on Emancipation Day, when we are joined by the illustrious persons whom you mentioned. I did swallow very hard when I was described as renowned, respected, and revered. I'll take that. I'll take that under advisement. But clearly, I do agree with Ambassador Gill, the newest commissioner for reparations in CARICOM, Grenada, having been the not the last, but the latest to establish a National Reparations Commission. I do agree with his answer to your question before you asked, which is that reparations is a process. And the question has to do with, we have not just been freed, or we're no longer enslaved, but the psychological baggage that has followed the so-called end of slavery 183 years ago is as strong today as it always was. So the work of the Reparations Commission and its respective entities is not only to pursue the political and economic aspect of reparations through reparative justice for slavery and native genocide, but also the repair that we have to do to our own minds, the need for us to be able to ensure that while we, as the reparations commissions, pursue that goal at the governmental level with the European Union, the work is equally possible and necessary at home to popularize the 10-point plan of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. One of the 10 points, including or in fact, many of the 10 points addressing the need for us to be able to make that transition, for example, from seeing ourselves as descendants of slaves, like Ambassador Gale said, but as people whose origins, whose history originated in Africa. And therefore, I would conclude by saying it is on that basis that Bob Marley, over 50 years ago, warned us that we have to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. That is the slavery that still continues, and the emancipation observations annually should add to our ability to spread that message at home. So one of the jobs of the GRC, now that it has formally joined the regional movement, is to take that message to communities across Grenada. And from what I have seen since your launching on the 19th of May, you do have the stakeholder assistance that will allow you to establish subcommittees, for example, in your various parishes and towns and villages
Right.
that would carry today's versions of online of town hall meetings, which would be a combination of both online and town hall. Sorry,
Right.
I have a tendency to just keep going
That's
like I'm
okay.
the only one.
That's okay. That's okay. But I just wanted to pick up on a very important point you made, and you referred to it as psychological baggage. And I want to toss that to Professor Dr. Damian Graves, the psychological baggage that Busquet mentions, and the trauma. This thing that was, abolished 183 years ago today, but here we are. And a lot of people even make just an, why are you still holding on to slavery? Why are we still talking about this? Let's examine that part of it, Dr. Graves.
Psychological, I call it psychological. The psychological and mental situation cannot be ignored. That it has left an indelible mark on us as Caribbean people, descendants of Africa. The question is, how do you ensure that you deal with that psychological part? The first thing we have to talk about is that, are people aware of their history? Are our children, are our young people, are people generally in the Caribbean, are they aware of the history? Do they understand what has happened? And first of all, we need to understand that we are not slaves. We were enslaved. And I think we have to get that right. I think we have to get the nomenclature right. I think we have to understand that we need to stop calling ourselves slaves. We have to call ourselves the enslaved, which is a critical dimension if we are to erase some of the psychological trauma that we have faced. But the difficulty, the challenge we have is how Emancipation Day can be the conduit of information to people within the region, specifically at this point in time in Grenada, so that people could understand and appreciate what it was to be enslaved. And there are two dimensions we have to look at. There's a positive and a negative. The positive is what we contributed as enslaved individuals within the region. So there's a lot we contributed that has not been highlighted. The other one is the negative, where it's downtrodden and so on, really dealt a cruel blow in terms of who we are, in terms of our identity. Some of us still suffer the problem or the challenge of an identity. Who are we? Are we European? Are we African? Are we West Indian? There's a great poet and literary expert who spoke about the plantation mongrels, George Lamin. And that's an instructive work that tells you about the struggles, psychological struggles that people had in terms of this whole business of enslavement. So change the nomenclature, start getting the information out there. Just imagine, for CSEC, you have students who talk about they don't want to do history. I have students who have come to St. George's University and don't know anything about enslavement. It is and it is how you craft the education of those people. It's how you put it across. You don't put it across, you put it across as an exciting story of our people struggling, who fought for emancipation, who fought for apprenticeship, who fought for independence, who fought to build a country almost from the bottomless pit. And you talk about Toussaint Louverture and Henri Christophe and some of the other great people across the region. If we can craft that story in a particular way and make it exciting, even from the point of view of animations among our young people, I think we'll begin to score some victories.
That's Dr. Grace. Dr. Bob. Yes. Dr. Grace speak of identity, and of course, you being a scientist at communication and also a scholar and lecturer. Our first language is not English, but do we even know our first language? So just expand on that identity part for us.
And identity is crucial and critical, because I think it's also important for us to think about our history as African descended people, not from the starting point of slavery. And so I think that what tends to happen is that we look at our history as people of African descent in the Caribbean as the starting point of the transatlantic slave trade. We are descendants of great kings and queens. We are descendants of the kingdoms of Biafra. We are descendants of the kingdom of the Ashanti tribe, the Ashanti. We are descendants of the Yoruba people. We are descendants of the Igbo people of the Bight of Africa. We are West African. That's who we are as a people. And I think what happens is that there is a disconnect between who we identify as in this current period and what our history is as a people. And so when to piggyback on what Dr. Graves, the point that Dr. Graves just made, is that when we're thinking about history, we have to think about it within the context of our own greatness as people of African descent. The transatlantic slave trade, as I'm concerned, was interrupted history. It interrupted our legacies. It interrupted who we are as people of African descent. And unfortunately, people in the Caribbean, I still say that we are still colonized within the context of how we divide ourselves, because we tend to think of ourselves as Grenadian, St. Lucian, Antiguan, Jamaican. These are all colonized constructs, names that were assigned to these islands by the colonizers, by Christopher Columbus and others, mass murdering, genocidal war criminals. And so we are also, however, people of African descent, and that point needs to be made in our history. And I think when we think about identity as well, identity starts from a very young age. Why is it we don't have education on African history and African identity from our elementary schools? Talking about the significance of African names. We have lots of African names in our dialect that we use, but do we really systematically look at it through the education system that will allow us to say that we will begin to identify ourselves from that very early age, and also reform curriculums? I'm also a proponent of curriculum reform, especially with respect to history. Unfortunately, a lot of our young people in Grenada do not know the history, for example, of the revolution. I'm talking near history. I'm not talking about history from the 16th and 17th century. And that needs to change. And that needs to change at a regional level. And when we're thinking about reparations as well, we also have to think about it within the context of education justice. Education justice, and ensuring that our education systems are indigenous, that it represents us as a people.
Talking about education, our youngest panelist is Rihanna Bub. Hi, Rihanna.
Good afternoon.
Good
Happy
afternoon.
Emancipation Day.
Happy Emancipation Day to you. So you've been listening to everything that all the panelists say, and you are uniquely perched because you're in school and you're doing history, you're doing psychology, and you're garnering information. Just give us from where you sit, how you see emancipation. What are your thoughts on reparative justice? And do you think through your educational life so far that you have received enough information about who you are and from whence you came?
Okay. Well, firstly, I would like to start by saying the way I see emancipation is that we were taken from a country, and we lost so much. We lost history, we lost names, we lost people, we lost family, we lost everything. And then we came, and then we basically were tortured and so on. And then around 1834, 1838, we were freed. And on the basis of that freedom, we were left with nothing. We got nothing, and we are still trying to move past this. That is how I see emancipation. And I would just like to say that as African descendants, we have come so far in terms of what we created, because as I said, when we were emancipated, we got nothing. And in terms of reparations, firstly, I would like to say that the information around reparation is so misunderstood, because when you ask certain people what is reparation, they tend to say it is Caribbean countries begging for money from people who already died, and they tend to say that enslavers are no longer with us, and so on and so on. But the root of reparation comes from Latin, and it means reparate, which means to change and to reform and to transform and to rebirth. It means to make amends for the crimes that were committed against us. So that is the way I see reparations. And in terms of what my school has given to me and how it shaped my identity, firstly, I would like to say that my father is Black and my mother is Indo-Caribbean. And I struggled with the identity of who I am and what I was and so on. But then I had an amazing history teacher in Form 3, and then I have a next amazing history teacher in Camp and they created this sense of pride in where I came from and who I am now.
Wow, wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you, Rihanna, from the mouth of babes. Well, the babe on the panel, that is. Yes, Rihanna, you made a really, 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 really great point. I love the use of the word amends because, yes, that's what every time we talk about reparations, you're right, that is where we head. Caribbean people, especially, we, the descendants of the Africans, we are the ones saying, well, look, we're trying to beg for money for slavery. People say that all the time. And amends, atonement, that's the kind of language, and I like that. And so, Buske, I come back to you. Where you are in St. Lucia and everything that you're doing, I'm sure you get a lot of that. And so the economics of it, and, people say compensation. Compensation is a kind of funny word because that's where people start thinking about money. But the destruction of the family structure, Rihanna just mentioned that as well. All these things that happened, is this reparative justice movement along that track for us to regain some of those things?
Thanks again. This takes us to my constant reference, and I'll be making lots of reference to it this evening, and that is the 10-point plan. Because the reparative justice, interestingly, we started off this movement in 2013 without the slightest idea what we were looking for by way of the economic aspect, the financial aspect. It wasn't until 2020 that we came up with the figure that we have put forward, 500 billion US dollars or euros. And interestingly, as well, in selling the idea of reparations around St. Lucia and going to those communities where we could point to things that have that we can point to make the case. You find two sets of responses. When we go to those areas, you find people coming out, and the main question from youth, like our friend who just spoke, is why haven't we learned all of that at school? Where can I find it? Can you send me the link? We need to know much more about that. But the response from the older population is, when are we going to get the money? How am I going to get my money? Are you looking for enough money for us to get? And we have to be able to navigate the selling of the message in the way that one of the earlier speakers mentioned, the need for us to be able to tell the story in creative ways. And I, for example, before today made a note about an animation story for Grenada, from Leapers Hill to the Grenada Revolution, or from Leapers Hill to wherever you want to take it. But that would be Grenada. But every single one of our Caribbean and CARICOM countries has a similar story. And if we are able to creatively identify those stories and sell them to our people, I do not read about Garifunas. I did not read about Garifunas in school, but in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is where Garifunas emerged, and they are now so populated in 4 countries in Central America, in Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. There are 800,000 of them, people of Caribbean descent, most English speaking, and we know nothing about them. We do not know much about the people we used to call the Caribs in Dominica, who are actually the Kalinagos and who refuse, including the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, refuses to use the word Dominica. And that takes me to one of, just briefly, to one of my peeves. I think that in the whole decolonization of our minds, we have to start looking at governments taking the lead, like was done with the reparations issue, where we did not wait for informed consent by way of referenda. Could you imagine if we had to have a referendum on whether CARICOM government should pursue reparations? We would still be having them, just like we are having the referenda for the Caribbean Court of Justice, which we know is best for us, but the informed consent becomes a brick. I think that in situations like Grenada, Barbados, and St. Lucia now, where you have administrations that can take decisions to take the reparation struggle to the parliamentary level, where you are committing government from, to a process that continues, unless you get in the form of St. Lucia, where you have one government that supports reparations and therefore it does, you have another that doesn't, and therefore reparations is dead. It is one of the things we need to be able to put on the regional and national agenda in a way that we have given recognition to the 183 years of the colonial observance of Emancipation Day that was imposed on us by a national holiday, without recognizing the 23rd of August, which was the night of the triumph of the Haitian Revolution that started the process towards agitation for ending of slavery.
All right, thank you so much. It is the panel discussion, Emancipation panel discussion. If you're just joining us, thank you for joining us. We're having the panel discussion around the theme, guided by our ancestral spirits seeking reparative justice. We take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Break and escaping to an idyllic, happy place? Well, finding it does not require you to go too far. You already live in paradise. All it takes is for you to go out and discover it. Grenada, Carriacou, and Petite Martinique are blessed with a wide variety of accommodation that satisfy any taste and budget. Find the one that suits you and your family and treat yourself while having peace of mind that your health and safety is a priority. Knowing that we have gorgeous waterfalls, stunning beaches, and flavorful cuisine, let's be tourists in our own islands and enjoy paradise at home.
I know you that from back to back, you know. When there's no way that a man could ever beat you. When you are about 5
What are the last?
Too fast, too fast. Man run with Hold on. Rennie, you're not the same girl. You're all the amount of boyfriend. In truth. Yeah. Nice your chance, Hold on. It's the walk.
Whenever a pedestrian is attempting to cross a pedestrian crossing or any other road, he must first stop and make sure that there is no oncoming vehicle. However, if there is any oncoming vehicle, he crossed briskly from one side to the other. If there is any vehicle proceeding, he ensured that vehicles come to a complete stop. After that vehicle comes to a complete stop, he crossed briskly from one side to the other. Remember, your safety comes first.
Welcome back to a panel discussion on this Emancipation Day. Of course, we are talking about reparative justice for Grenada, and if we're guided under our Emancipation team. Our expert panelists this evening, Ambassador His Excellency Ali Gill. He's our CARICOM ambassador, and he's also the chair of the Grenada Reparations Committee. Earl Bousquet, he is the chair of the St. Lucia Reparations Committee. Dr. Kellon Bubb, an assistant professor of media and communications at Montgomery College in Washington, D.C., and the producer of the Bubb Report. Rihanna Bruno, she's a student at TAMCC, and she's pursuing social sciences, sociology, psychology, and history. Dr. Damian Graves, a professor at St. George's University, the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. Dr. Graves, Ambassador Gill, and Earl Bousquet, you three especially have been really into the reparations, organize the structure that is to get the movement going. On the topic of reparations, can each of you kind of tell us about the local and the regional movement and your roles in it? And we're going to start with you, Ambassador Gill.
Okay, and just to set the record straight, Dr. Bob is a member of the Grenada National Reparations Committee as well.
Oh, great.
So that he is also intimately involved in the reparative struggle. As chair of the Grenada Reparations Committee, I'm also a commissioner on the CARICOM Reparations Commission. All of the committees linked into the CARICOM Reparations Commission. Now, Grenada is one of, as Earl pointed out earlier, one of the latest islands to get ourselves up and running. I believe that St. Lucia, for instance, is probably arguably the most active reparative committee led by Earl at this time. But what we are endeavoring to do, as Earl has pointed out, one of the more important things, I mean, when we speak of reparations, we also have to think about the education and the sensitization and the awareness of our own people. So all these programs that we are embarking on is also to ensure that we bring that message to the people, because a lot of times persons do not understand, as Earl pointed out, when you speak of reparations, people think about cash. We're not going to get with money and so on and so forth. And but just to take a little a sidestep quickly, Madam Moderator, with regards to the teaching of history, which we spoke about, the other panelists spoke about earlier on. For instance, in Grenada, our history starts, or that is how it is taught, when Columbus came, and that to me is a grave miscarriage of historical justice, in the sense that the history of Camahon, the history of the early inhabitants, do not start when Columbus supposedly sighted Camahon. We have to appreciate that there were persons already living on this land. And then the history do not continue merely by Dupaque and his men committing genocide against the Kalinago inhabitants of the country. And people have to appreciate that what we refer to as Leaper's Hill, as far as I'm concerned, is a monument of genocide of the first inhabitants. You see, and so that we have to put these into context when we teach history, so that people appreciate. When we speak, we as an independent people, we as an emancipated people must write and tell our own history. And going through school and so on, a lot of the history has been written and so on is by those who colonize us. And so we tend to teach what others want us to learn, rather than teaching what we want our people to learn. And that has been a fundamental error that we have made, a strategic error. And the governments must take leadership with regards to at the highest policy making in the region at CXC level, our curriculum, our syllabus, and so on, and we keep speaking about it, needs to be reformed so that we, as an independent people, we teach our people what it is that is important for our development and our emancipation. Now, on the issue of reparation, but Olbuski spoke about the 10-point plan. And that 10-point plan includes, what are we asking these European powers to do? And one of the first things we're asking for is a full formal apology to us, right? It begins, you know, even to the Christian people. The Christian people says, for you to get forgiveness, you must admit that you have sinned. And as such, we say to the Europeans and so on, the colonizers, that they must admit that they sin, that they have committed genocide against the early inhabitants and so, that what they have done, this whole institutional racism and so on, that we see in the United States, that we say Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and so on, and you see everybody talking about, it's a colonial legacy. It's a legacy left by slavery, where the colonizers and so on, or people, the Caucasians, for instance, institutionally believe that we as black people is inferior. You see, and that from generations on after generations, it is that inculcating of that value to them, seeing us as inferior. And so this Black Lives Matter didn't start in 2019 or 2020. You see, and we in the Caribbean are much more fortunate than the Americans on the American continent, because slavery was what ended in the U.S. in 1865, formally maybe, and then you had a whole heap of Jim Crow laws that really and truly went up right up to 1963, 1961, 62, with the passage of the civil rights laws. But even then, the southern states, you know, even up to today, they have institutionalized certain laws and so on that continue to make it appear. So we say the first point on our 10-point plan is full apology for us, and so on. Admit that you have done something wrong to humanity. Secondly, repatriations. The Rastafarians have been saying for years that they want to go back to Africa. Marcus Mosiah Garvey, UNIA, you know, he said Africa is for Africans at home and abroad. And it is not a story that is not an argument that we say everybody goes back to Africa. But we are saying for those persons who are interested, that want to go back to Africa and so on, the colonial powers must put these structures in place for that to happen. In other words, they must ensure, bear the cost of transportation and resettlement, because after all, it is they who moved forcibly so Africans away from the homeland and so on. And there is this last point I'm making before I think there is this myth, you know, among our people here in the Caribbean and in Grenada, hear it all the time. When you speak of African consciousness, when you speak of repatriation and so on, they said, we're better off here in the region than if we were in Africa, because they see on CNN and BBC and so on the way Africans live and so on and so forth, and they see the poverty and so on and so forth. But they fail to appreciate that Africa at the time was the most developed continent in the world, and that slavery and the slave trade and so on interrupted the development of Africa. In fact, to use Walter Rodney's term, it is how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And persons do not understand these things, you know, so that we see Africa as a black continent. And when we speak of the psychological damages and so on, you know, we think that misfortune happened on Black Friday, that death is black, that negative is black. And so you come to associate the color of your skin as negative, because everything from Black Friday to You go to mourn someone's death, you wear black. All of these negatives, and so the black book. When you're in debt, to somebody in somebody black book, it seems as though black is always in the wrong and always in the negative and so on. It is that mental awakening that I don't wear no black clothes and so on to go to funerals. I make that deliberate decision because death at the end of the day is celebration of life, supposedly so. And but we must, when we say black is beautiful, we must mean black is beautiful, and that we first of all have to put an end to the negative stigma that we place on the color black. I think I've had quite enough in this piece.
Thank you, Ambassador Gill. Earl Bousquet, before I come to you, Rihanna, why is this movement of reparations, why is that important to you?
Okay, before I start, I would just like to briefly talk about the economic wealth that Britain amassed from Caribbean slavery, right? At the point of emancipation, British Caribbean plantation owners got 20 million pounds. This can now be translated to $21 billion in today's currency. From the transatlantic slave trade itself, they got 60 million pounds. Now it can be translated to 10 billion pounds. A part of Britain's GDP at the time of the 1800s was around 11.1 in its GDP, which can, in today's currency, is around $336 billion. So the reason why reparations is so important to me is that all of this money, all of these profits went into developing another nation where countries like Grenada is still struggling to catch up because of this disadvantage, right? From that 20 million pounds, Grenadian slave owners got 611,936 pounds in reparation, while enslaved Africans got nothing. So over 400 years of slavery, and you're left with nothing, while the people who enslaved you got something. I think it's time that atonement and ownership and responsibility and all these things be taken by Britain, but I feel like they won't, because that is them admitting ownership for crimes committed against a people. So that is why it's so important to me.
Thank you, Rihanna. Well said, well said. You hit in the heart of the thing.
Yeah.
Earl Bousquet, your Ambassador Gill gave us about 3 of the 10-point plan. So 2, full apology, repatriation. What say you? What are the others?
The others include, not necessarily in that order, they include the establishment of museums, artifacts, to house artifacts and the sort of things that are still in private ownership that establish that link between the Caribbean and Africa. It includes scientific and technological transfer, which is something that we were disadvantaged to over a period of time. It also includes, and that has already started between the University of the West Indies and another university in the United States, and that is transfer of medicinal technological ability, so that UE and Glasgow have a joint project which is for 20 million pounds today, but nonetheless it meshes into giving the using the figure to tell a story. We also have, as he mentioned, well, I wouldn't go into what he mentioned, but these are some of those I could remember offhand. But there is also, since then, something that we have launched, and that is the renaming project, where we would like to see governments and through the reparations committees identify monuments to slavery and genocide that we continue to revere, like everything from Queen's Parks to all of the other things, the Nelson statue that was gotten rid of in Barbados. But part of our efforts as well since then has also been the launching of a 1-year virtual regional reparations history lecture series. And it took me that long because it is all online and it is aimed at taking the reparations and history message in particular, and that's what we're dealing with tonight, the history lesson, taking it to the various countries through the school system. And on the third Thursday of every month for the past year, Grenadian schools, St. Lucian schools, and schools in all of the CARICOM territories have had the ability to tune in at the same time on the same day to a 2-hour history lecture that would have helped prepare history students for the Cape, CSEC, and whatever regional exams. It is something supported by the Caribbean Examinations Council. So when I listened to Rihanna, I mean, I was filled with pride because these are the young people at school who we want to reach. But guess what is our experience? While the program is aimed for students, it is also of interest to teachers and principals. And that also brings home the lesson about the extent of the psychological slavery we still go through, where in 2021 today, 18 years after the launching of the reparations movement by CARICOM, you still have principals and teachers who, because they do not support reparations, do not facilitate the lectures. And when I talk about the need for gubernatorial intervention, this is a CARICOM project. Right. It is not even a project that belongs to any national committee. And therefore, we would hope that, like in the case of St. Lucia, the chief education officers can find a chair at the table at the national reparations committees to be able to ensure that these lectures and the programs that you have been putting on would get to each and every school. Right. So these are some of the things we're looking forward to.
Right. Thank you, Earl Bousquet. Dr. Graves, are you surprised that CARICOM government are kind of, moving on this, even to the form of they've established this? I mean, from all evidence, it seems that we're taking the lead on this.
Yeah, it seems that we're taking the lead on this, but we're still taking the lead on it, but it seems that among some of our governments, we are still very slow. And that is why there has to be strong advocacy with various governments. For example, there's a new government in St. Lucia. I know that there are elements among those who will form the government, there are elements who do understand the idea of reparations. But this is where now my good friend Earl Bousquet must be a strong advocate and make early representation of the reparations with that committee. And Brenda, it's not a difficult thing to understand. What we need to establish is that a reparations commission or the Caribbean reparations movement is saying, listen, you guys impoverish us. You created a world system that relegated us to the periphery rather than the center. You disrupted our developmental process. We are asking you to partner with us. That's what we're saying. Partner with us in ensuring that we catch up, that we develop our people in health, in education, in housing, in community development, in education. Partner with us.
I like the use of the word partnering. So in that partnering, is there a partnering, or do we envisage a role, and any of you could take this, a role for the African nations? Because we were
Absolutely.
mentioning earlier about colonization and how not even our first the language we speak is not our first language and all of that. But in Africa, there are countries that have been colonized in Africa where there's an MP, a parliamentary representative, and there's still the village chief.
Absolutely.
We have not done that. So are we going to be looking to Africa to partner?
Yeah, we have to look to Africa and Europe. Listen, Ali could tell you, and Mr. Bub and Dr. Bub can tell you, we must not compartmentalize our history. I say to my students, although I don't teach history, I teach social sciences, but social sciences is history. And therefore, you cannot compartmentalize. While the Industrial Revolution was taking place in the mid-18th century, 1750 on about, the Caribbean played a very, very important role in that Industrial Revolution. Africa played an important role, right? Latin America played an important role. The United States played an important, the whole world was there. But our difficulty, what we have sought to do is compartmentalize the history. So we're talking about a little piece there, the Caribbean, a little piece there in Africa, a little piece there in Europe. But if you look at the history, whatever was going on in Europe at the time, or the Caribbean, impacted each other. There was a symbiotic relationship taking place. And that is why we are talking about the creation of the world system that has relegated us to the periphery rather than the center. And the final point I want to make on that is that if you really want to see this movement grow, don't just depend on governments. The commissions have a responsibility, a moral responsibility, to be strong advocates among young people, among people generally, because that is where the pressure is. If you can get them to understand what is going on, if you can get them to appreciate what is going on, if you can get them that to be part of the intellectual diet of what is going on, they're going to put the pressure from the bottom to the top. And those at the top, at the apex, in terms of decision making, will have absolutely no choice but to make movements.
So, Dr. Bob, how do we know that disconnect? You know, people have to connect and feel this reparations thing. See how passionate Dr. Graves is and how informed Rihanna is, and Olbuske look as if he wrote the book on reparations. And we know Ambassador Gill, how steeped he is in it. That disconnect, how do we get people to actually to know the story, but most of all, how will they, that's one of the things they would want to know. How will this benefit me? How will this benefit?
I mean, you know, it's a multifaceted question, right? How will this benefit me? And I go back to Rihanna made a very salient point about the beneficiaries of the transatlantic slave trade, how they benefited. We're talking about the intergenerational transfer of wealth by these multinational corporations and the church, by the way. Grenadians and people of African descent in the Caribbean tend not to examine the role of the church, who also benefited, by the way. The Anglican Church and the Catholic Church also benefited from the spoils of colonialism and slavery, and that also has to be acknowledged. But the point is that the same way that we're talking about that intergenerational transfer of wealth, of the profits from slavery of these multinational corporations and religious institutions, they benefited significantly. Their descendants, the children of slaves, the children of slave masters, they benefited tremendously. And we see that with respect to what Britain has become. The Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom, as Ambassador Gill said before, would not have been possible without the free labor of people of African descent. So it really, when we're thinking about benefits, right, we're thinking about, well, how would it benefit us? And I think it's important for us to sort of unpeel the layers and frame the narrative in such a way that it's not abstract, because I think people tend to think about reparations as this abstract conception, when it's really not an abstract conception. What it is, you say, okay, we are saddled with debt, we are saddled with development challenges, we're saddled with unemployment. We're saddled with lack of opportunity for higher education for some. There are several ways in which we can benefit, in which, and our challenge as a commission is to ensure that we can identify specific deliverables that can benefit the people. And it's not only about money, and that's what it is. Everybody think, well, you're going to get a check. Right? That is a big part of it. That is a big part of it.
I saw someone asking recently, well, how are these governments going to split up the check?
Right, and it's more than that. There are institutional elements that we also have to consider as well. You have to consider issues, for example, such as I said before, debt cancellation. We also have to, consider issues around how we are framed as sort of a quote-unquote third world. And remember, the idea of the third world only came about when we, as formerly colonized countries in Africa and the Caribbean, decided that we were going to become independent. So that this, and this is where the idea of the non-aligned movement came from. Because the non-aligned movement said, okay, you want to define us as a third world? We are going to define ourselves in a way that establishes our own identity. So it really comes down to, again, the 10-point plan, again, just to go over and review what the 10-point plan talks about. It talks about ameliorating issues around the public health crisis. When we think about our public health institutions, the legacy of colonialism and slavery is reflected in our very weak public health institutions in the Caribbean. Our diet is also a reflection of the legacy of colonialism and slavery, right? We talk about high blood pressure and you talk about life expectancy, diabetes, lifestyle diseases. All of these are a legacy of that period, and that needs to be resolved. You talk about illiteracy eradication, right? And that is another specific benefit that we can identify. You're talking about, as I said before, that African knowledge piece, ensuring that we can be proud of our heritage, be proud of our African names. I am proud to say that I changed my middle name from John to Jaramu, right? And much to the objection of many, because they said, well, what are you doing? I changed my wardrobe to reflect a more African aesthetic, and people they laugh at you, they make fun of you for doing that, right? Oh, you are a man now, they say things like that, right? And again, there are these particular things that can benefit. You're talking about, the point was made earlier about technology transfer, ensuring that our people can benefit from a lot of the technologies that are used in the so-called first world, that we can also benefit from that in the developing country context. So those are some of the significant benefits that we can speak to, because I would say this, identity is critical and important. When we migrate to the United States, when we migrate to the diaspora, people don't ask us whether we're Anglican or Catholic, right? Or they ask you, oh, you're from Grenada, and these are the things that identify Grenada. Jab Jab, right? Carnival, Soca, Talpri, Mr. Killer, things like that, right? That's part of our cultural identity, okay? And so these are some of the benefits that we can think about, but I think it really comes down to ensuring that we do the work even in our own individual lives, in our own interpersonal interactions with our families. Again, the institution of slavery was extremely multifaceted, right? So whatever we can do in our own individual, personal interactions with others to really speak to reparation, I think that would also be good.
Well said, Dr. Bob.
Yeah.
Dr. Bob mentioned the acquiring of wealth by corporations and so on, and it just brought me to the point where there are families in the world where the generational wealth has come from ancestors of slavery. Remember David Cameron, when he was the Prime Minister of England, his big thing with reparations is because his family, they owned over 500 slaves. Yes. They were proven to have held in Jamaica. So how is the CRC and local reparations committees, how are they configuring this into the ask for reparational justice, Ambassador Gill?
Very good question. And that if you read the news generally, these issues come up. So you don't have to be active in reparations, because there is this MP in the UK, and he is supposed to be the wealthiest member of parliament in the UK, and his wealth is directly linked to a plantation in Barbados. So you have these direct links. There are universities in the US and in the UK in particular that was funded from the profits of slavery directly. Is it the chair in Harvard, I believe, one of the major law schools in the US was funded by the profits of slavery. But allow me to put this in context by reading a little piece of historical thing here. I just want to read it. It says, in conformity with the economic value, the West Indies were regarded as a jewel in England's crown in the 18th century. Around 1776, the tiny island of Grenada, 311 kilometers thereabouts, was following Jamaica, Great Britain's most valuable possession. Grenada exports more produce, and that's a quotation from the UK Parliament. Lord Drummond speaking. Grenada exports more produce to Great Britain and Ireland and consumes within itself more British and Irish commodities than any of our West Indian islands, Jamaica alone excepted. So in 1776, Grenada was the most valuable colony to the UK outside of Jamaica. And it goes on to say, the aim of investing, and that's what Dr. Bob and Dr. Greaves already spoke about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And hear it. The aim of investing an extensive amount of capital for sugar production, the mercantile product par excellence, was to receive profits as large as possible within a span of time as short as possible. The profits were realizable only in Great Britain, where they could be enlarged by further investment, example in the new industries. Through their working power and their commercialization, the slaves were forced to aid the development of the beginning of the industrial society in Great Britain. And therein lies the economic foundation of Great Britain through the backs of the enslaved people. In other words, the profits from the sugarcane, from the rum, from the tobacco, and so on, was used to fund new industries. It was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. And, when we're talking reparations and so on, it's not far-fetched. For instance, and let us touch a little on Haiti. Haiti has been in the news recently and so on. And Haiti was the first in 1804. And Henry Christophe, who controlled and declared himself king on a part of the island of Haiti, was Grenadian. Mm-hmm. Yes? Yeah. And he refused. The French said to the Haitian leadership that to secure their independence and security, they have to compensate the French planters for the loss of property in their slaves and their lands. Henry Christophe refused, and he died in 1820 or thereabouts. And the island of the part of the island of Haiti was then united, and the Haitian government in 1825, 1824 thereabouts agreed to pay compensation to France in the sum of $150 million. At that time, 150 million francs in 1825. That works out over $25 billion now. Haiti then had to mortgage, had to find monies to pay. In 1948, 47 or thereabouts, they finished paying over $60 million francs. So that these monies that for years, Haiti was directly paying to France for their own, when they obtained their own freedom and their own independence. That monies that Haiti gave to France for compensation for, and listen, it wasn't no negotiations, Charles X sent a warship into Haiti and so on and tell them this is what we are doing. And so that money that Haiti spent gave to France in terms of reparations or compensation because the French lost their lands and their slaves and so, could have been spent in Haiti to develop its roads, the education system, health system, and so on. So, in a real sense, Haiti is not just the poorest island in the Western Hemisphere, poorest country in the Western Hemisphere by accident. It is by design. You know, and this is something that we seriously have to address. So that and if you look at the history of Haiti, after, you know, gaining its independence and so on, throughout the 20th century and the United States involvement and so on, from the French, the United States in particular, they have played a dirty game and supported strongmanism and dictatorship and so on in Haiti and so on. So I just make that point so you can see in a direct sense. Now, not only that, when in 1838, let's begin in 1834, because the first part of compensation for the planters in the English-speaking Caribbean was the 4 years of apprenticeship. And then the British government passed a bill to compensate the planters and so on who had owned land and, of course, slaves in the English-speaking Caribbean to the tune of £20 million. So the planters and so on, they were compensated by the British government for the loss of their lands and the profits and chattel slavery. So that these are direct, and that's institutionalized. Yeah. You understand? It's the British government doing it, it's the French government doing it. It's not, you know. So that when we speak of reparations, these are what we're talking about. The real person who produced labor and work for free never get compensated. That can't be fair, it can't be just in the sight of God, neither in the sight of man.
Atonement is required. Atonement is required. It is. Dr. Bob, quickly before we go to break.
Wanted to add quickly to what Ambassador Gill was saying about Haiti, and we also have to remember that when we think about the embargo on Cuba in the 21st century, that is also analogous to what happened in Haiti as well. Because remember, when the African people in Haiti decided that they had the temerity to free themselves and to say, we're not going to wait for you to grant us freedom, we're going to take our freedom by force, using African spiritual practices, which we shun, and we say, you know, every time we talk about Haiti, oh, the reason why Haiti is like this is because they're working over here, and, you know, and you know, that they believe in bad and witchcraft and all of that. When in fact, what happened to Haiti was what is happening to Cuba in the 21st century. Because there was a naval blockade, Haiti couldn't trade with any of the major world economies at the time. And remember, Haiti was also the crown jewel of France with respect to the wealth that country produced by way of sugar and slavery.
We need to understand too that reparations, the whole call for reparations, did not begin today, as he said. It's a long time ago. A very, very long time ago, in terms of what people have been asking for. What history in years past people have been asking for in terms of what is needed for the development of the countries. Remember, as these two gentlemen suggested, the enslaved were not given everything. They were sent on their own. Fend for yourself. We have nothing to do with you. We have nothing to do for you. You have to fend for yourself. And even as we march, as we go through the pages of history in terms of the anti-colonial period and decolonization and independence, there were governments like Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica and so on, who asked, as part of the independence package, to give us something to help develop our people. We need a package. We need you to partner with us to develop ourselves. But we were blatantly refused that developmental kind of assistance. So we wanted to be in alliance with them. We wanted to be to partner with them in St. Lucia, in Dominica, in Grenada, in Jamaica, in Trinidad. We're saying, listen, this is what has happened. Give us something to help us start our development process. But we were refused.
Rihanna, this dehumanization of a generations of our ancestors, which is enslavement, and now we're asking for reparations. Speaking from your generation, from your point, your generation, what is the most critical? There could be a number, but what are the most critical components for you in terms of what would reparative justice look like for your generation?
I can't speak on behalf of my entire generation because
Well,
everybody
you're
has
representing.
different perspectives. But what it would look like for me would be, firstly, I believe in the formal apology to accept that a crime was committed and people were dehumanized. Because if you're talking about when enslaved women were when women were bought and sold into slavery, she wasn't only bought for what she could do in terms of labor. Her entire sexuality was bought. And as a young woman myself, I find that horrifying because you couldn't legally rape an African woman because she was property. She was part of the estate. So I think that apology is necessary. I think that reparative justice would take the form of putting more emphasis on, I would say, education in terms of teaching us more about our history, because the fact of the reality is that many people from my generation, as you put it, we do not know our history. When I was talking about how happy I was to be on this panel today about talking about emancipation and reparation and what reparative justice would look like for Grenada and where you could invest it in terms of healthcare and in cultural development and where you could reconstruct the whole aspect of what is diet. People was like, why are you so interested in this? It was past. But the thing is, we are still connected to the past. If you think about the legacies that was passed on through us, our ancestors live in us, because as many of the panelists say, reparations isn't a new term. Dr. Hilary Beckles was quoted saying that reparations started in the mid-19th century. It continued in the early 20th century, then in the mid-20th century, and then it's back again. He said that it's in its 8th iteration. So we keep coming and asking for this justice, this atonement, this responsibility for British state and other metropolitan countries, because indigenous societies were lost, were wiped out. Then you have the indentureship system, which was like a new form of slavery, and nobody's claiming this history. Everybody's just saying it happened. The enslavers are no longer alive. The people who supposed to demand the reparations aren't alive. But the fact is they were demanding these reparations, but they were refused. So we have to take up the responsibility of asking for these reparations for them, because they cannot anymore. So I think that reparative justice would look like an apology and certain investment in certain aspects and certain aspects of the Grenadian society.
Thank you. Well said, Rihanna. We are having the panel discussion, Emancipation, a panel discussion put on by the Grenada Cultural Foundation. We take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Dreaming of taking a break and escaping to an idyllic, happy place? Well, finding it does not require you to go too far. You already live in paradise. All it takes is for you to go out and discover it. Grenada, Carriacou, and Petite Martinique are blessed with a wide variety of accommodation that satisfy any taste and budget. Find the one that suits you and your family and treat yourself while having peace of mind that your health and safety is a priority. Knowing that we have gorgeous waterfalls, stunning beaches, and flavorful cuisine, let's be tourists in our own islands and enjoy paradise at home.
We look for containers of water where we can lay our eggs. Close to your house, we love to suck your blood and bite your legs. We don't live in swamps or rivers, we live in your house day and night. We'll give you dengue fever when we give you a great big bite. We hate it when you spray, it's insect repellent we fear. Throw out that water, we're out of here.
Welcome back to Emancipation 2021, the panel discussion, Reparative Justice for Grenada, and we are talking under the Emancipation theme for 2021, guided by our ancestral spirits seeking reparative justice. Earl Bousquet, seeking reparative justice. Is it? Do you feel like the ground is swelling on this one? Do you feel that this is the time something would actually start happening in terms of something formal from CARICOM making that advancement to the our enslavers, Europeans and others?
Certainly, this is the first period in the history of the demands for reparations that our youngest CARICOM Reparations Youth Ambassador, who I just heard from Grenada there, we're in the 8th cycle. But this is the very first time that we could say that we can see the light. So that the likes of Professor Hilary Beckers and others can confidently say today, as they continue to, especially when we put a price tag to the reparations, economic reparations, reparatory justice bill, is that we can see this happening, hoping in the first half of the 21st century, but certainly in the second half. So in all the centuries, this is the first time we can see a light at the end of on the tunnel, where reparations is on the agenda in the U.S. It had been long before George Floyd, but it has gone even further since then. In United Kingdom, it so happens that the administrations, like in most other territories, the parties in power do not support reparations, but certainly the Labour Party, as the 200th anniversary of the so-called abolition of slavery approaches, the British Labour Party has already launched a program where it would be saying that if it is in office, these are the things it would do to repair. And I continue to feel that with more and more CARICOM governments coming on board, who not only as products of the University of the West Indies, but particularly as persons who have lived the life that requires us to correct the past. Take the new Prime Minister of St. Lucia. He was sworn in on Thursday. He doesn't yet have a cabinet. Parliament hasn't decided when it will meet to have its first session. But today, he issued a national address on reparations in which he's made certain, gave certain undertakings, including St. Lucia playing a greater role at the CARICOM level in pursuit of reparations. We have the situation where who in Barbados 10 years ago could ever have thought you would have seen Lord Nelson's statue being driven away from Barbados. And the 1776 statement that Ambassador Gill quoted earlier, it is important to note that the American Revolution also took place in 1776. But in 1792, 3 years after the French Revolution, the freedom fighters in St. Lucia established a republic. And the British and French came together because, like Grenada, St. Lucia has a joint French and English background. They came with 10,000 troops and tried to overtake those freedom fighters. They failed. Then they came back with 17,000. And they were able to get rid of that St. Lucia Republic because it was threatening the French slaves and the British slaves, the enslaved, really, to think revolution. So even before the Haitian Revolution in 1804, a black republic was established in St. Lucia that it took 17,000 troops to bring down. And I went through infant and primary school singing the Grand Old Duke of York. He had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill and marched them down again. It is only now I'm knowing from the processes, revelation of history yet written or given, that that was actually in St. Lucia. With the 10,000 men, the Grand Old Duke of York could not bring down every one of our territories, including Grenada and all the others, have these stories that we must tell. Why was Guave called Guave? Was it because of guavas? Why was Janglais called Janglais? Was it because it was an exclusive preserve for English people, which is what Janglais means in French? All of those aspects of our history need to be revisited. We talked about the African connection. You know, I love to make the point that Swaziland changed its name in the 21st century and became the first country in Africa to call itself Eswati, using an internet, giving the name of a country an internet name, like my granddaughter would say. And we look at the French connection. We continue to talk about the British, but the French owe us as much as the British because they were as present.
Correct.
And we who have to make cases for that reparations, we cannot afford to forget the French. And yeah, you wanna? I'll stop here.
All right. I'll come back to you. I'll come back to you and pick up on the end of what you were saying, because I still want to get from you what is like what would a formal approach look and sound like. Yeah, from CRC's point of view. Though, as he mentioned the United States, there is a groundswell, if you will, for remedy on reparations in the U.S. I was following recently, and I saw that Representative Sheila Jackson, she brought this bill to the floor of the Congress. So you are in academia and you are on the ground and have a feel of what's happening. What are you getting from the U.S.?
Yes, and I think the United States, they have to in many ways acknowledge the work of CARICOM in helping to advance that, as you say, a groundswell among people of African descent in the United States. And I think the call for reparative justice in the United States echoes the call in the Caribbean, and the reason why it has taken on a new life of its own in this period. It really comes down to issues of policing in communities. It also comes down to income and wealth inequality, and what we see as just the glaring differences on outcomes with respect to health outcomes, life expectancy outcomes, with respect to educational outcomes, the state of our inner city communities and what that looks like, criminal justice, again, just the inequalities in sentencing distribution, what happens when a person of color goes to the court, and the sentences that they receive versus when a white person goes to the court, a Caucasian person goes to the court, and what happens to them. So that the reparative justice movement in the United States is really it's been influenced in many ways by what CARICOM has led, and Sir Hilary Beckles. And of course, we also have to acknowledge that our struggles are intertwined. They are intertwined. So that when we're having a discussion on reparations in Grenada. It's interconnected. We all, I say, the difference between an African American and a person of African descent in the Caribbean really has to do with the slave ship, the stop on the slave ship. Some of us got off in Grenada, some of us got off in St. Vincent, some of us got off in Florida, some of us got off in Mississippi, some of us got off in Haiti. Yes, and that really comes down to really seeing the benefits of a reparative justice. Again, reparative justice in the United States is also about reforming and dismantling institutional racism as well. We cannot talk about reparations in the United States without talking about institutional racism and the legacies of it. And again, racism is not only about someone not liking you because of your skin color, but it's also about the institutional impediments to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is what America loves to glorify within the context of its exceptionalism, right? But you cannot say that you are a representative democracy. The United States only became a representative democracy after the Civil Rights Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Baines Johnson. So that the bill that Representative Sheila Jackson Lee has proposed before Congress really speaks to those issues of institutional racism that is deeply entrenched in the American history and entrenched into just how we as people of color in the United States confronted these issues of racism.
Ambassador Gill, you are also an attorney, and when someone comes to court for, you get a court psychologist to deem that someone who was raped and pillaged, they need to be, you need to ascertain the amount of trauma and that sort of thing. In this whole reparative situation, and just basically what the transatlantic slave trade did to us as a people in terms of the trauma, I'm just looking at, I think I did this in school, and I found this in some information Donlin sent to me, and going back to Gordon de la Motte's book, Reconstructing the Black Image. I'm just quoting from it. There was slave laws in there. So like for leading others to run away, you were pinched 3 times with a hot iron. For following others in a runaway, a leg cut off, or if pardoned by master, your ears cut off, and 150 lashes. Failing to report a runaway or planning of an escape, burned on your forehead, and 100 lashes. Absence for 8 days, 150 lashes. Absence for 12 weeks, loss of a leg. Absence for 6 months, death. For lifting a hand to strike a white person or for threatening violence, you were pinched with hot irons and hanged. These were slave laws. These are things that happened, trauma. And so the one of the things as we seek reparative justice, the family structure. I mean, remember, people were uprooted from where they were in Africa, sent to the Caribbean. Can you tie the collapse of the family structure in the Caribbean in a social sense? Dr. Graves, you're a social scientist. I'm coming to you too. Can you tie the collapse of the family structure in the Caribbean, the fact that our men are missing, women are not, as educated and as powerful, there are no queens in the village, so to speak, to take care, or chiefs as they have in Africa. Can that also be linked to reparative justice?
The family structure in the Caribbean is a legacy of slavery. And you said it, where Africans were uprooted, kidnapped, taken away from their homes and their families in Africa, brought on this ship. Even when families were captured, they were separated to go on different plantations or even on different islands. A male African was sold for what? Average price around 60 pounds, a female a little less, 55 pounds. And in those days, they looked to bring more males than females. So already you can see the disparity with regards to companionship. And of course, they were chattels, they were not seen as human beings, so that there's a lack of emotional attachment of men and women and so on. Black men have the same urges that we have now that our ancestors had. And so to the women and so on. They need to have families and children and everything else. And not to mention, I think that our sister spoke with regards to the women and how the women were raped by the white planters and persons from the planter class on the plantation and so on. And so that the psychological trauma is an untold story. And just to say that that is another part of the 8-point plan with regards to psychological rehabilitation. And earlier on, Dr. Bob spoke about with regards to the names. So not only were we stripped, our families were destroyed and so on, but our names was taken away from us. I have a fundamental problem, I have said it all the time, even on those programs. Why is it when a child is christening in the Catholic Church that the priests say what is the Christian name of that child? That practice is part of the enforcement of the stripping of the black identity. So that when Dr. Bob spoke earlier with regards to the church, the Catholic Church owns slaves. Yeah, they can untrust, and they too must apologize. Yes, but this continued practice of saying to person, what's the Christian name of a child? It is part of the enforcement of that colonial legacy to strip us from our name, from our identities. You know, look at it. The indentured Indians came after, but they came with their families, their names, their songs, their languages, and so on. You know, the Africans have been stripped from their names, their languages, our families have been destroyed. I mean, it's just, so that is why we speak in terms of emancipation, yes, from from the plantations. And Dr. Bob also spoke about, you know, the hassle a black man undergo when you put on a dashiki. Other black people laugh at you and look at you, what you're playing. And the fact of the matter, when we speak about mental, why is it that we, as a people, we are giving our children these Western names? You know, I was having a very important discussion with John Angus Martin, the foremost Grenadian scholar, historian, and so on, who did a lot of work with regards to names. And, you know, on the plantations, enslaved persons was given one name. They were called Peter, Paul, John, Patrick. Right? Now, Mary, Jane. Okay? Now, after emancipation and so on, and in the early 1920s and so on, when registration of children names and so on came into being, and you had to go and register your children and so on, you know what happened? A lot of the surnames that we carried were actually the first names of enslaved persons. So if your name was Langain, when you go to register your son or your son, for instance, you say, oh, they ask you for a surname, what's your second name? You say John Langain. So the first, you understand? So persons have to understand all of this trauma that we've been through. Basically, it is so much that, you know, just trying to understand ourselves in a serious way. Why we are who we are. Why somebody's a Louison, or a Hood, or a Greaves, or a Gill, or a Bob, you know, all of these things. So the education for us is extremely important as part of the reparative struggles going forward.
So, Brenda, the point of departure is the debate. Was slavery born of racism, or was racism born of slavery? That is the debate, and debate continues. The debate continues. Now, here's what we want to talk about. The point of departure also is that the Europeans had to have found a way to justify slavery or enslavement. And part of the justification of enslavement and the destruction of one's identity and so on was to say, listen, you are not Caucasian, you are black. And therefore, that is part of your retardation, the fact that you are black, right? And all of the institutions partnered to create that psychological damage. The church, right? the parliament and all other institutions came together to ensure that that took place. So the debate continues. Was slavery born of racism or racism born of slavery?
The very dehumanization, I mean, that it's actually racism. And remember, even the parliamentarians, maybe the church in some respects, and whoever was leading at the time, remember they got learned men, doctors, and ambassadors to do a study, so-called study, that basically came out saying that we are less than, our brain is smaller, all these things. So from jump, we were always cast as the less than.
Can I read for you?
Sure.
Edward Long, a British plantation owner in Jamaica, wrote in 1774, "In general, they, that is the slaves, are void of genius and seem almost incapable of making any progress in civility. They have no plan or system of morality among them. It being a common known proverb that all people on the globe have some good as well as ill qualities except the Africans." In other words,
Dr. Bob?
Yeah, just to add to that point, again, race is a social construct, but the notion of race was established by the Spanish, first of all, in which they said that, we're going to define people according to black, white, we're going to define them according to Indian, and all of these different racial categorizations. And so when we think about us as being black, that was something that the Spanish created. As a way to again separate us, right? And to see us as other than. Yes? And the need to convert us and to civilize us using religion as the basis for doing so. And so that is also an important point for us to understand, that our definition in who we are, you talk about identity earlier. Who are we? We are people of African descent in the Caribbean, in what Paul Gilroy calls the Black Atlantic. Yes? But it's because of that particular social construct of race. Race is a social construct. Okay? We are all biologically the same. And so saying that someone is black, someone is white, that was one of the enduring legacies of colonialism and slavery. And we see it today with respect to colorism in our own islands, where people of a lighter hue are viewed differently from someone who's of a darker skin. Like, you have a child. I remember I had a cousin that was born in Venezuela, and he has darker skin than the other members of the family, and everyone was beside themselves. Well, how we black so? Right? And it goes back to that legacy, which is still embedded in our psychology.
I saw a lot of Caribbean women bleach their skins.
Yes, yeah.
That's where the psychological trauma remains, and the psychological damage. Code Noir, you're 1/8 black, 1/4 black, 1/32 black, 1/16 black. That's where go ahead.
I just say it, and fundamentally, we are much more than the color of our skin.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so that even today, people look at the Olympics and they see Egyptians and Moroccans and so on, lighter skin, and they wonder if they're Africans.
Rihanna, jump in here on the conversation. Yeah, what sort of impact would you like restorative justice to have?
Many of the panelists talked about the psychological trauma that took place, and it is extremely important that I mentioned that this psychological trauma is seen especially in Grenadian society with the idea of color and colorism. It is seen that if you have a little Indian in you, you're a red person, or if you have a little something in you, you're this person or that person, and then that is when we see the difference between the identity. At the end of it all, we're still black. Even if you have a little mix in you, you're still black. So I think that this justice we're looking for should take the form of ending some of these psychological traumas. But the thing is, that does not come with government. That does not come with compensation under the form of reparation. That comes in the form of knowing of the people having this conscious awareness. And I often say that as my generation, we need to get pissed. And I say pissed not in hatred, because that was something that my teacher made clear to us when we were learning about slavery, because in fact it's a brutal thing to learn about, that people were so dehumanized and so shamed and such, that when you get pissed, you don't get pissed in this hatred, but pissed in the understanding and the conscious awareness of where you came from and where you would like to go. So that is how I would like to see this justice, that we develop this conscious awareness, and that comes in the form of educating the younger generation. I try my best to educate my younger sister on everything that I know and everything that was taught to me.
Good. I think you're doing a good job. You educate a lot of people here today.
Can talk about that, and maybe Dr. Bub is basically a lot better prepared to discuss this than I am. What is a great debate in the United States now about teaching this whole business of institutional racism, and that you're now making people hate white people. Maybe you can discuss that a little more.
Yeah, so I come from the critical scholar tradition as well. I'm a critical scholar fundamentally, but what is happening in the United States, which we've seen before, but it's of a different iteration now, is that they are attempting to really erase notions of institutional racism by going after critical race theory. Because what critical race theory, by the way, critical race theory is a graduate level course. That is not something that is taught to undergraduates. It's not something that is taught in middle school, elementary school. It's something that is taught at the graduate level in law school, or if you are pursuing a master's or PhD in a justice related field, or if it's an elective, you take a critical studies course, a critical race theory, which is part of that. And so what you're seeing is the attempt by the same elements who were proponents of Jim Crow, for example, by the same elements who were proponents of maintaining the status quo with respect to Southern slavery. They are the same elements today who are saying that, you're trying to make us feel bad when we tell our ancestors, or when we tell our descendants or white descendants about the evils that they did. But the fact is, a lot of your descendants are today beneficiaries of that system of slavery in the United States. Because when we think about the United States, remember, emancipation happened in the United States almost 30 years after. Yes, towards the latter part of the 17th century, as compared to the Caribbean, where slavery ended in 1836 to 1836. Yes, so we have that where they're saying, no, we just want to erase that history. Imagine telling our Jewish brothers and sisters that we are going to erase the history of the Holocaust because we want to, we're afraid of making Germans feel bad.
No,
Yes, that is a fact of history.
Yeah.
In the same way that colonialism and slavery was a fact of history. Okay, and trying to sort of erase those historical facts by going after the intellectual tradition, to me, is a very dangerous direction that these folks are taking.
Yeah, I know. But really and truly, to me, racism is very institutionalized and systemic. I mean, one to one, if you meet your white neighbor, they don't mete out any sort of thing to you. It is in the system, and it's part of the superiority and supremacy business. That's what it's about, because we are the less than. That's what that is. Yeah. So that's very foolish what they're doing.
It's to be done not only among blacks, but also
everybody.
among Caucasians. Everybody must be part of this experience.
It's a human thing. Earl Bousquet over in St. Lucia. So, what are the next steps for the CRC? Where are we going in the next 6 months?
The CRC has, in the last 6 months, brought together in February of this year, brought together the CARICOM leaders to decide on the next approach to the European Union on the issue. Because despite the fact that the first letters requesting a meeting with the European Union to discuss reparations has not been replied to by the European Union, but individual countries that were participating in slavery have responded all in the negative. except in the case of the Netherlands, where they would say, we would like to talk. The long and short of it is that a new strategy is being approached where we have to bring together the Caribbean, the CARICOM, the African Union. We have also now in the process through the ambassador of Antigua to the OAS, who is the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps there, able to take the reparations issue to the OAS as well. We also have a strong reparations representation in the diaspora, the Caribbean diaspora. There is a strong reparations presence in Europe. And what we need to do is to have that tricontinental approach where we will look to summon, with the support of the African Union and CARICOM, a reparations summit at which the two sides, the Europeans and the victims of the slave trade, which we must remember was more about economics than racism, not that it devalues the role of racism, but the next step is a reparations summit. We have also decided to expand the scope of membership of the reparations national committees by ensuring that Rastas, indigenous people, and youth are represented on the national committees because they are integral parts to the history. We have also, like I said earlier, adopted the Sir Arthur Lewis blueprint for reparations, which is what will be presented to the Europeans insofar as how we see about the redistribution or the distribution of reparatory justice by giving all to the CARICOM, which would then come up with a mechanism of how it is shared. It's our business to decide how we share what we get from what we deserve. The other decision that was taken in February is to give recognition to those reparations movements in the remaining British colonies, like Tortola, and in the French colonies, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Cayenne, where those reparations movements are even had a longer life than we have in CARICOM, and they too will be given a seat at the regional table. Okay. So there's a combination of things to be done, the international work and the regional work insofar as CRC is concerned. But Grenada, as the 12th of the 14 CARICOM nations to have established a committee, has joined to make that movement stronger, and it will be up to the national committee, as indicated by one of the earlier speakers, to ensure that we don't just depend on the governments and the national committee, but in the same way that we take the COVID issue to the communities to better inform people. That also brings to mind the fact that President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, on behalf of the AU, participated in the opening of the celebration of Black History Month in the Caribbean in a webinar organized by the Jamaican reparations movement, in which he made the point that the COVID vaccine distribution reminds us of what apartheid meant to South Africa, and it strengthens the case for the countries seeking reparations to also take that in mind. It was good being with you tonight.
Thank you so much, Earl Bousquet. Those will be your final words. I was just about to say that. Rihanna, your final thoughts?
I read your mind.
Rihanna, your final thoughts?
Okay, thanks. Before I end, I just want to say a quote by Dr. Hilary Beckles. He said that the demand for reparation will be taken through every door, every diplomatic door, and down the corridors of every court. And I think by gathering all of these amazing scholars and these people to come and talk about reparations and emancipation and about honoring the past is us taking up the mantle and us taking the issue of reparations through those diplomatic routes and bringing it to these courts. So I just want to say thank you for having me here.
It was an absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for participating. The future is bright. Dr. Graves?
Hilary Beckles as well, just like our young panelists did. So Hilary Beckles has been quoted as saying that the 21st century will see the reparations movement as the greatest movement of the century. And I see that happening. And I believe it's going to happen as long as we become strong advocates, remain strong advocates, to get the pressure from below, to get those at the apex to move with some degree of haste.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graves. Dr. Bob?
Yes, so the work has to be done. It's important that we, this is not about all talk, but it's about ensuring that we have follow up, that we continue to not only nip away at the edges, but actually get into the trenches and do the work. And that is critical because, again, no successful movement. Again, we have to remember that colonialism and slavery lasted for a very long time. It's deeply entrenched. So that when we are thinking about reparations, we cannot think about it within the context of a year or 2 years. It's long-term work. It's intergenerational work. It's critical work that needs to happen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bob. Ambassador Gill?
Well, I'd just like to use this opportunity to implore my fellow countrymen to become aware, educate themselves, read, listen, get involved in the struggle for reparative justice, and to be more conscious. I believe that the consciousness of our people is extremely important for this reparative struggle. For people to appreciate who they are as a people. And as I would end on a quotation, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. And that was an original quote from Marcus Mosiah Garvey, put in song by Robert Nesta Marley.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Gill. And just to wrap up, basically, as to encapsulate the conversation we had this evening from this esteemed group of panelists here. So insofar as we're finally having a national conversation about reparations, there appears to be evidence of structure, some growing support for those. And what came out of this very edifying and spirited discussion is that we have to do it the right way, and we seem to be on the right track. The overarching I mean that takes the overarching theme of today, really seeking that reparative justice, takes that into consideration. And reparations are really an atonement for the dehumanization of our ancestors and descendants who have been wronged by enslavement. We thank you everyone for participating. We really, really appreciate it. Just to remind you that the Emancipation celebrations continues. Tomorrow you can trek your way all up to the beautiful La Digue in St. Andrew as Seydu. They'll be unveiling a plaque for a national hero, a monumental cultural figure, an icon who still lives and reigns with us. I call him Sir Elwin McCulkin. The Sir is from me. You know him as the Black Wizard. So that'll be happening tomorrow. This event was put on by the Grenada Cultural Foundation, SEDU, and the Grenada Reparations Committee. We'd like to thank the GIS, the Government Information Service. It's Sunday, and they are here assisting us with the broadcast. Kudos to Ronde Ali, Sherry Ann Noel, Dovel Emery, and from the Grenada Cultural Foundation, Donlin Watson Henry. Thank you so very much, and the other members of your team. To Ambassador Ali Gill, Earl Bousquet in St. Lucia, Dr. Kellon Bubb, it was a pleasure to have you here with us. Dr. Damian Greaves and Rihanna Bruno. Thank you so very much, panelists. We really appreciate it. And to all of those of you who joined us on air and online, Happy Emancipation to you. I am Brenda Batiste, your moderator. Until next time, bye-bye.